Now, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the work we're going to be studying today is the most important and influential piece of European art music composed in the 20th century. It's over 100 years old now. Back in 2013, they had the centennial celebration for the Rite of Spring, and yet it still retains its capacity to shock, to frighten, to hypnotize, and electrify. One of the markers of modernist works of art is that they tend not to age in the way that other works of the past do. Even a century later, a work of modernist music can still feel new because modernist composers were concerned with experimentation, with innovation, and with challenging their listeners. While we should certainly bear this all in mind, it's also true that an aura of mystique and a tendency toward myth-making has arisen toward the Rite of Spring. In the popular imagination, audiences are often distracted by tales of the ballet's scandalous opening night in 1913, by the bizarre choreography of Nijinsky and the spiky, cacophonous exterior of Stravinsky's music. But audiences are often preconditioned to register this spectacle as something totally alien and bizarre, like a ballet from another planet. The Rite of Spring has become something of a big bad monster that can't be tamed, like the T-Rex or the Stegosaurus that duke it out in Disney's Fantasia, while Stravinsky's score crashes and smashes in sync with their blows. You as the audience are just supposed to sit there and be pummeled by its deafening dissonances, to welcome this asteroid to smash you to bits, just like the asteroid in the Fantasia sequence. I say enough. I say let's try and understand this beast, and to see the human side in it. Even to see the moments of sheer beauty that are often forgotten in favor of uglier passages. It's so much easier to just lie back and accept the comment, to say, this is too complicated to understand. I'd rather it just explode me. We're not going to do that today. Rather, we're going to sit down and we're going to dissect some portions of the score, measure by measure, to comprehend its inner workings. Don't be worried if you don't know how to read music or have just a little musical experience, because I'm going to make this enjoyable and engaging for all of you of any musical level. And I think that once we're done, you'll find that Stravinsky's Rite isn't an extraterrestrial hunk of rock, ice, and minerals, but a living, breathing being with arteries, bones, and muscles. So to begin with, we have to understand that this work, despite its surface strangeness, didn't come out of an alien civilization, but has strong ties to the folk cultures of Russia and Eastern Europe. Now, the Russian Empire, which existed from 1721 until the Bolshevik Revolution of 1912, included Russia and most of Eastern Europe. It was a kind of culturally and geographically in-between territory that's not quite European, but also not quite Asian and not quite Middle Eastern, though it included cultural minorities from the Middle East and Asia. The majority of the people in the Russian Empire, however, belonged to an ethno-linguistic group called the Slavs, the Slavic people, which are distinct from the Germanic and Latin-descended peoples of Western Europe. The Slavic people had their own history, language family, and religion. In the modern era, that would have been Eastern Orthodoxy, which separated them from Western Europe. Yet there was always a sense among the ruling elites in the Russian Empire that they needed to aspire to the model set by Western Europe. The rapid advances of the 16th century onward didn't go unnoticed by the tsars like Peter the Great or Catherine the Great, who felt that their people were being left behind while their neighbors to the west modernized. Remember, I mentioned in our first lecture that the modern era began or corresponded with the end of feudalism in Western Europe. Now, vestiges of feudalism still hung around in Europe, in Western Europe, but it had been almost totally eradicated by the end of the 18th century, especially with the arrival of the French Revolution. In Russia, by contrast, the serfs, the peasants who worked the land, weren't officially liberated until 1861. While Western Europe was exploding with modernization, Russia was only just getting rid of this slave system left over from the Middle Ages. In the 19th century, there was a greater tension in the Russian Empire than in Western Europe of this period between the old way of life and the process of modernization. This had to do with just how enormous the empire, the Russian Empire was, and the fact that a huge percentage of its population lived in the country. There was a more pronounced contrast than in Western Europe between the urban centers of modernization, like St. Petersburg and Moscow, where the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie imitated the Europeans and even abandoned their native language to speak French. So there was a more pronounced contrast between that, the urban life, and the peasants and landowners in the rural territories who still clung to pre-modern folk culture. Now, many Russian artists were actually opposed to modernization and modernist aesthetics, since they felt that something was being lost in this process of what we might call Europeanization, that is becoming more like Western Europe in language, dress, and mannerisms. In his novels, Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina, Tolstoy contrasted the decadence of modern city life in 19th century Russia with the purity and hardiness of the peasant population, who lived off the land in close-knit communities, staying true to their heritage, their customs, and their faith. With Tolstoy as their model, there was an emergence of a pronounced nationalist strain of Russian art in the 19th century. This wasn't necessarily nationalist in the sense of fascist or totalitarian. Fascism didn't emerge until the 20th century, the early 20th century, out of Italy. I know that term nationalism has taken on those associations today, and that kind of intolerance would indeed emerge during the first half of the century across Europe, out of Italy first, as I said, and also in Russia. And while there was definitely some politically motivated chauvinism among some Russians, many artists were simply concerned with preserving folk practices that were quickly being eradicated through modernization. At the same time, for an empire of such magnitude and diversity, which included hundreds of different ethnic groups, there was no way to define exactly what constituted Russianness. So this nationalist strain in the arts necessarily meant formulating a sense of identity that was somewhat artificial and constructed. So most artists rallied around the shared cultural past of the Russian Empire's ethnic majority, the Slavs. So this nationalist preservation project also extended to music during the 19th century, when we finally get a distinctly Russian style of classical music. Homegrown composers in the Russian Empire had tended to imitate Italian models, which had been imported since the 18th century. But in the early 19th century, composer Mikhail Glinka, pictured here, began to incorporate Russian folk songs into his operas. He also turned to quintessentially Russian source material, notably in his opera Ruslan and Lyudmila, which is based on an epic poem by the great Russian writer Pushkin, who in turn was inspired by Russian fairy tales that he had heard as a child. Now, Glinka's compositions set off a nationalist movement in Russian classical music, especially among the next generation of mid-19th century composers, represented by a group of 5 composers known as the Mighty Handful, or simply the 5. These included some names that might be familiar to you. So there's Mily Balakirev, Alexander Borodin, and Cesar Cui. Those 3 may not be familiar, but the next 2 certainly will. Modest Mussorgsky, whose tone poem Night on Bald Mountain was adapted in Disney's Fantasia as that terrifying Satanic Ritual. That was my favorite when I was a kid. And then Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Now, Rimsky-Korsakov, who was primarily known as a composer of opera, is especially important for our discussion today. In addition to composing orchestral and operatic works, he also explored the emerging field of musical ethnography. He would have folk singers, often servants or peasant people. He would have them perform traditional repertoire for him, which he notated down musically in classical Western notation. And he would collect these in volumes of folk music, like the one on the right. This became the modus operandi for many nationalist composers in both Western and Eastern Europe during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So composers often became ethnographers themselves, going from village to village and collecting folk songs or music for folk dances. Or else they would study the folk song collections compiled by previous musical ethnographers. So for composers like Rimsky-Korsakov in the Russian Empire, Russian folk music became the raw material for a piece of art music. They would often alter the folk song to better fit within the notation and the aesthetics of Western classical music. This usually meant by supplying a piano accompaniment with Western tonal harmonies, so that the classically trained singer could perform this in their repertoire next to Schubert or Schumann lieder. So they wouldn't be singing this in a folk style. They would be singing it in a more classical operatic style, but they would be authentic folk melodies, albeit classicized to fit into the classical vocal style. Composers would also invent pseudo-folk songs based on existing ones to give a theme in their symphony or an aria in their opera to give that music an ethnic flavor. In the end, it really didn't matter to them whether a folk tune was genuine or fake. Folk music wasn't viewed as a repertoire of original pieces that belonged to individual creators like Schubert or Schumann. Rather, folk music was treated more like a musical dialect that one could speak in, like a linguistic accent, and that could be appropriated by imitating the melodic and rhythmic idiosyncrasies of that style. Now, the rhythms in particular of Russian folk music are important for our discussion today. So I want to point out an example from Rimsky-Korsakov's 1882 opera Snegurochka, the title of which is usually translated in English to The Snow Maiden. Now, the final chorus of this opera is set in a very unusual time signature for the time, which is 11/4. Now, we need to, for this, time signatures will be important for our class today. So I want to point out here that the top number, 11, in that fraction looking thing, tells you how many beats are in the measure. Then the bottom number tells you which rhythmic unit, either a quarter note, an eighth note, a half note, a whole note, which of those units is equal to one beat. In this case, the 4 means a quarter note. The quarter note is like the first note pictured there, without any flags, and it's filled in. The note head is filled in, it's not empty. So we know that each of these measures will be 11 of those quarter notes. And you can count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 quarter notes. And then each of those empty half notes is 2 beats, so 7, and then 8, 9 for the first whole note, 10, 11 for the second whole note. So let's hear what that sounds like. Now, you're probably used to meters organized into groups of 2, 3, or 4 beats. So that would be the top number of those meters would be 2, 3, or 4. And the most common that you're used to is probably 4, 4, 4 quarter notes. And then the other more common one is 3, 4, like a waltz meter. But here we have this bizarre 11/4. Russian folk music features these kinds of unusual beat organization. I've shown how this meter breaks down, how even though the larger unit of a measure is 11, there are little subunits within it. And you can see how there's this asymmetrical alternation between groups of 2 beats and a group of 3. So you get this very catchy but kind of lopsided pattern of 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 da 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 da. You can feel that lopsidedness gives it a very distinct dance feel. So Rimsky-Korsakov's Snegurochka, much like Glinka's Ruslan and Ludmila, that first great work of Russian nationalist opera I mentioned, Snegurochka is also based on Russian folk tales, but its sources are deeper than mere fairy tales. In his libretto, Rimsky-Korsakov, he wrote the libretto for himself to set, he incorporated elements of ancient Slavic religion from Russia's pre-Christian past. Now, compared to Western Europe, Eastern Europe and Russia was Christianized relatively late in the 9th century, so that vestiges of their so-called pagan past, their pre-Christian religion, vestiges of that culture stuck around for much longer and were preserved in folk customs and folk songs. Rimsky-Korsakov's Snegurochka, which is set during that pre-Christian era, revives many of the elements of the polytheistic Slavic beliefs. So in the opera, Snegurochka, or the Snow Maiden, she's a teenage girl of supernatural origins, and her presence in the village has brought about a 15-year-long winter, like some kind of, what's the TV show, kids? The Winter's Coming. That one, you know the name. Game of Thrones. Now, at the end of the opera, Snegurochka melts away like Frosty the Snowman. She's made of snow. And spring returns to the village, finally. In this final number that we listened to, this chorus, the villagers join together in a prayer of thanksgiving to the Slavic god Yarilo, who is a god of springtime, youth, agriculture, and fertility. Baby having. He was typically invoked at spring celebrations among the ancient Slavs, where they would conduct these processions, these little marches and other rituals to hurry the arrival of spring. Russia, much like northern Canada, is a cold place with a winter that feels endless, like the one in Snegurochka or Game of Thrones. When Yarilo returns at the end of the opera, you can see in the stage notes I have included here that Yarilo appears out of the mists, enshrouding the summit of Yarilo's mount. So he peeks out like the little sun baby in what's that in Teletubbies. So when Yarilo returns, it represents the feeling of joyous relief that came every year when winter finally withdrew in Russia. It's an experience that would have connected 19th century composers like Rimsky-Korsakov with his Slavic ancestors. But despite the process of modernization, seasons continue to cycle, the winter continues to be frigid and awful, and the arrival of spring continues to be welcomed and a time to celebrate, as we're all looking forward to now in the beginning of February. So Slavic pantheism was a way of tapping into this heritage and this historical relationship between the Russian folk and the natural forces of the Russian landscape. It was out of this movement of 19th century Russian nationalism in the arts that the young Igor Stravinsky emerged. Stravinsky belonged to a generation of composers that followed the mighty handful, Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, and others. And in fact, his teacher was Rimsky-Korsakov. So Stravinsky would have been immersed in this compositional practice of pulling from Slavic myth and culture as a source of inspiration. His earlier works are indebted to those of his teacher. He incorporates Russian melodies or pseudo-folk songs into his distinctly Western classical style. Stravinsky also inherited the Russian knack for orchestration, especially for vivid and exotic sonic textures that Rimsky-Korsakov was known for in his operas. He would use these textures to depict magical or supernatural elements in his operas that were based on Russian fairy tales. I'll mention as an aside here that this totally captured the imagination of French composers like Debussy, who were obsessed with Russian composers and took composers like Rimsky-Korsakov, but more so Mussorgsky, as the model for their music. So Stravinsky, as a young and up-and-coming composer with a knack for colorful orchestration and a distinctly Russian folk flavor to his style, Stravinsky would have fit perfectly into the vision that Sergei Diaghilev had for his dance troupe, the Ballet Russe. Recall from our Afternoon of the Faun lecture that Diaghilev had formed this company with a group of young Russian ballet dancers who were dissatisfied with the conservative, old-fashioned style that was taught at the Imperial Ballet School and then performed at the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg. So they broke away from the Mariinsky and formed a traveling company that would focus on cutting-edge choreography, design, and music. And there was no better place for such an ensemble to thrive than in Paris, the capital of modernism in Western Europe, as we've seen time and again in this course. Now, Diaghilev and his co-creators, the designers, composers, and choreographers he would hire, they were famous for their lavishly Orientalist productions. We discussed the Ballet Russe's 1910 ballet version of Rimsky-Korsakov's orchestral piece Scheherazade, which was inspired by the Middle Eastern tales of the 1001 Nights. This was definitely in the vein of Saint-Saëns' Danse Bacchanale from last week, and the Parisian audience ate this up. They loved the whole erotic and exotic spectacle of an imagined East, and they especially loved the strange energy of Nijinsky in the main role. Yet Diaghilev also wanted to promote distinctly Russian works of art. And he realized that Parisian audiences regarded Russia and Eastern Europe as exotic in the same way that they saw the Middle East, India, or ancient Greece, the settings of some of the other Ballet Russe productions. They kind of lumped Russia in with this vague and mysterious Far East and this imaginary fairy tale past. But while the Ballet Russe representations of non-Western cultures in Diaghilev's productions weren't particularly authentic, his Russian-themed works could incorporate genuine elements of folk culture, since the creators themselves were Russian and familiar with this culture, and in fact coming out of this movement of nationalist rediscovery of Slavic folk culture and folk music. So while Diaghilev was taking a risk by commissioning a ballet from this 20-something kid, Stravinsky, a composer who hadn't had a huge success period, let alone one that would make his name familiar in the West. At the same time, Stravinsky was the logical choice, as he could supply music that would suit the exotic tastes of the Parisian public, but would also be true to his Slavic folk heritage, and whose musical style aligned with Diaghilev's mission of introducing the West to Russian culture. So Stravinsky's first work for the Ballet Russe, The Firebird, was a breakout success. The libretto combined different Russian fairy tales, offering an opportunity for Stravinsky to provide magical-sounding music in the vein of his teacher, Rimsky-Korsakov. You can see in that photo a picture of a very young and confused-looking Stravinsky next to his very tired and old-looking teacher who died, I think, the following year. An especially virtuosic bit of orchestration was Stravinsky's scintillating music that he wrote to depict the blazing wings of the Firebird, whose costume you can see on the right, designed by Leon Bax, who did the designs for Afternoon of the Faun. And of course, Stravinsky incorporated folk-inspired themes, like his music for the 13 Princesses in this ballet, which is modeled after a Russian horovod. That's K-H-O-R-O-V-O-D, a horovod, which is a type of round dance, that is, a dance performed in a circle. You have them in many cultures, but this is the Russian version. And in fact, the opening theme of this number, the horovod number in the Firebird, is based on an existing folk tune, a genuine, authentic Russian folk tune that his teacher, Rimsky-Korsakov, had quoted in an earlier orchestral piece. So Stravinsky is pulling on the same folk songs as his teacher and inserting them into his Russian-themed ballet. The most striking feature of the ballet, however, is Stravinsky's innovative treatment of rhythm. This is obviously indebted to Rimsky's unusual folk-based rhythms, like the 11-beat meter that we saw at the end of Snegurochka. But Stravinsky goes much further than his teacher, exploring extreme asymmetry and syncopations. Syncopations, that is, throwing off our sense of where the downbeat, the strong beat is. The most famous example of this is the whirling infernal dance for the evil sorcerer Cochet and his monstrous minions. The Firebird, she comes down and whips up the monsters into this frenzied dance that tires them out. And that's this famous infernal dance. Let's listen to that. So from just the first bars of this dance number, you'll get an idea of the dance's pronounced syncopation, how the pitches in the melody tend to fall on the offbeats rather than lining up with the strong beats of each measure, or how they even fall on the back half of beats. When Stravinsky does emphasize the strongest beat, that is the downbeat or the first beat of a measure, he makes sure you know it. The composer punctuates the dance with these giant downbeat chords for full orchestra, which sound both crash-like because of the huge bass drum stroke and shriek-like. There's this piercing piccolo at the top of each of the chord. This, and that's get used to those shrieking piccolos because you're going to hear a lot of them in the Rite of Spring. So with the success of the Firebird, Diaghilev commissioned another ballet from Stravinsky for the following year, 1911. So Petrushka was also based on Russian folk themes, but not so much on fairy tales, than on these annual village fairs that would take place around what's called Shrovetide in Russia. You may know it better as Mardi Gras, the wild parties that you have before Lent. So this ballet was, like the Firebird, choreographed by the Ballet Russe's main choreographer at the time, Michel Fokine. But the title role was danced by Nijinsky, who's pictured here next to Stravinsky. Stravinsky and Nijinsky. And Nijinsky heartbreakingly portrayed Petrushka as this sad clown figure. We can't get into Stravinsky's score for Petrushka now. It deserves its own class period. But I'll mention here that it's a kind of transitional work between the Stravinsky's emerging innovations in the Firebird, which we got a sense of in that infernal dance, and then the completely radical new musical language of the Rite of Spring. Many of the techniques of the Rite of Spring, especially the use of folk songs and the kind of chopping up into bits and incessant repetition of folk songs that we'll see, those techniques are in a kind of nascent form in Petrushka. So we'll focus our attention today primarily on the Rite. But I bring up Petrushka here just to show how Stravinsky and Diaghilev were continuing to pursue Russian folk subjects in their collaborations, and also how Nijinsky was now starting to play a role in these collaborations, though as a dancer and not yet as a choreographer, as he would for the Rite of Spring. Now, Stravinsky claims that while he was putting the finishing touches on the Firebird, he had a, quote, fleeting vision which came to me as a complete surprise. I saw in imagination a solemn pagan rite, pagan that is pre-Christian. Sage elders, seated in a circle, watched a young girl dance herself to death. They were sacrificing her to propitiate, that is, to gain the favor of, the god of spring. Now, there's been some debate over whether Stravinsky really dreamt this in the first place. He lied or fudged the truth about a lot of things in his biographies and interviews. Now, Nicholas Roerich, that's Roerich, his name is at the bottom of this painting that he executed in preparation for The Rite of Spring. Nicholas Roerich, who was Stravinsky's collaborator on The Rite of Spring, claimed that it was he, in fact, who had approached the composer with this idea, with this scenario. Now, Roerich was a Russian artist and archaeologist, and later a Buddhist and a mystic. He's a really fascinating figure I'd suggest you look into, who was also an expert in the ancient Slavic people. Now, in 1908, Roerich had actually written a description of a pre-Christian spring ritual that is very close to the scenario of the Rite of Spring. He wrote, quote, they as in the ancient Slavs, they would go into the forests for a long time. They would dance rapid dances. They would play on horns and pipes of bone and wood. The horovods, again, the round dances, would gleam with amber pendants, tabs, stone beads, and white talismans made from teeth. The people would rejoice. It doesn't really matter in the end who came up with this idea, as such ideas were in the air at the time. As we've seen from Rimsky-Korsakov's Snegurochka, the characters in that wear exactly the same types of ancient Slavic costumes that Roerich would design for the Rite of Spring, and they do the same kind of horovods and rituals to welcome the spring. So these ideas were in the air. People knew about these ancient Slavic things, and they would have been on the minds of both Stravinsky and Roerich. At any rate, these two men, Stravinsky and Roerich, co-created the concept for the ballet behind Diaghilev's back. When Diaghilev found out about the secret project, he was understandably miffed, but he soon came around. He had already had a success with Stravinsky, and the scenario for this ballet was going in the direction he wanted in ancient Russian folk culture. So he gave it their blessing. And with Diaghilev's blessing, Stravinsky and Roerich made a pilgrimage to an artists' colony in Russia called Talashkino, Talashkino, Talashkino. And this was a retreat started and funded by a Russian princess who sponsored folk revival artists who would live and work on the estate, building furniture and other crafts. So this was an ideal setting for Stravinsky and Roerich to create their Slavic ballet. They would have been fully immersed in both the sights and sounds of traditional Russian peasant life. In the evenings, a folk singer would perform, and Stravinsky would transcribe the folk singer's songs. Some of those may have even made their way into the Rite of Spring. Roerich got a chance to peruse the princess's collection of authentic peasant costumes to get ideas for the Rite of Spring costumes. While his set, the backdrops that he painted for the set, are somewhat idyllic and pastoral compared to the jaggedness of Stravinsky's score. They don't quite match up with the aesthetic of Stravinsky's score. His costumes show a meticulous attention to historical detail, down to the little folk pattern motifs that adorn the peasant's folk dress. You can see that on the linings, the hems of these tribal men's costumes in the ballet, these little squares and diagonal patterns. They were all taken from authentic folk motifs that had sacred significance to the ancient Slavs. This ballet then is thoroughly authentic, save for one rather big detail. There's no evidence that the Slavs ever sacrificed their own people at their spring rituals, or at all for that matter. I read that some tribes may have sacrificed prisoners of war, but human sacrifice was more common among other indigenous peoples unconnected with the Slavs, a world away, notably the Mesoamerican civilizations like the Aztecs, who would ritually slaughter, and I'm not exaggerating here, thousands and even tens of thousands of people over the course of a few days. It staggers the mind to think of that much bloodshed. So even if Roerich and Stravinsky aren't 100% faithful to Slavic history by fudging and inventing facts to some extent, We have to remember that they're dealing with a work of theater, and there needs to be drama and excitement on stage. A pastoral scene of ancient Slavs dancing peacefully with flowers in their hair like a bunch of hippies, that would hardly capture the imagination. But a vision of a maiden dancing herself to death, now we're talking. That's what the kind of thing Diaghilev liked to see. Now, this no doubt played into the Paris audience's stereotypes about savage indigenous peoples with whom they were having greater contact with as Europe continued to expand colonially during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But the element of sacrifice in the ballet opens up deeper layers of meaning, as Stravinsky and his collaborators ask us to reflect on our position as modern people in relation to the so-called primitive people being depicted. Whether we as moderns have really advanced beyond our violent prehistory, or if there's something connecting us to those ancestors which have been resurrected on stage, just as they're resurrected by the tribesmen within the plot of the ballet. We'll get into those questions later today, but I want to briefly discuss the innovations of Nijinsky's choreography before we jump into the score. Nijinsky, as we saw, had already experimented in 1912, the year before the rite, with recreating ancient cultures in the Afternoon of the Faun, where he imitated the flat, sidelong poses of figures painted on Greek faces and in other ancient artworks. While he didn't get to plan with Rührich and Stravinsky at the artist retreat in Russia, Nijinsky's choreographic contribution perfectly fit with the concept that the composer and the designer had come up with. What would we call that idea, kids? Perhaps a Gesamtkunstwerk, where all the elements, design, scenario, music, and choreography are all working toward the same goal. So how did Nijinsky work toward that goal? So classical ballet technique, with its emphasis on refinement, poise, grace, and elegance, would have no place in the kind of society depicted in the rite. It's a product of, classical ballet is a product of the 18th century and was refined in the 19th century. It has nothing to do with the ancient world. Nijinsky totally inverted the aesthetics of classical dance to capture the ancient atmosphere of this ballet with his choreography. Rather than the toes pointed outward, Nijinsky's dancers point their feet inward, like a duck. You can see that girl on the far left. Rather than standing tall and upright with an open torso, Nijinsky's dancers are hunched over, especially that third dancer from the left, the third and the fourth dancer. Rather than stretching the arms outward to frame the body, Nijinsky's dancers pull their arms close to their bodies as if they were shivering. This gesture that the four girls on the left are doing was particularly famous. And in fact, at the premiere of The Rite of the Spring, when they were doing this, someone yelled out, "Get this girl a dentist," something like that. Rather than the graceful hand gestures, Nijinsky's dancers clenched their hands in fists that they used to beat the ground. Rather than holding their heads high, Nijinsky's dancers tip their heads to the sides at odd and almost unattractive angles. And most importantly, whereas classical ballet is about lifting upward and defying gravity in seemingly impossible leaps, the kind of leaps that Nijinsky himself was known for, in the rite, Nijinsky's dancers are exaggeratedly earthbound and low to the ground. Any jumps that they execute aren't about being suspended in the air, but about the thud of returning to earth. I will mention some more features of Nijinsky's choreography throughout a discussion of the score, but you should obviously watch the production yourself. And any of you who are interested in re-choreographing the ballet should definitely check out the book by Millicent Hodson, which I've placed on the course website. She's the one that recreated the Nijinsky's Afternoon of the Faun choreography, And she did the same thing here. She painstakingly pieced together the rite of spring choreography. But while for the Afternoon of the Faun, she had a that dance score that Nijinsky did, where he had his own dance notation, that didn't exist for the Rite of Spring. So she had to work from production photos. I think there were literally two of them, this one and that one. Maybe a few more, but it's in the single digits how many photos were available. So she worked from those, from historical accounts like reviews or people's diaries, and sketches by artists, particularly this one artist, Valentine Gross Hugo, who did these really quick, rapid action sketches just to give the idea of the layout on the stage and some of the movements and the choreography. And from all of those little bits and pieces and fragments, she was able to recreate the choreography. It's absolutely amazing what she did. Before we move on to the score, I want to add here that the primitivist aesthetic of Nijinsky's choreography totally scandalized the opening night audience at the newly opened Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris. It's still there. You can visit this theater. There were loud arguments that broke out between those who hated it and those who defended it. And so loud were these arguments, in fact, that no one could really hear the music, not even the dancers. And Nijinsky had to shout his counting and probably clapped really loud from backstage. He wasn't dancing in the ballet itself. He was backstage. He only choreographed it. Now this riot at the right, as the opening night has been dubbed, has totally overshadowed the history of the work. It's a fun little story to put in the program notes or to talk about on a podcast or something. And it's a nice, and granted, it is a nice reminder of how groundbreaking Nijinsky's choreography was, and also gives an image of a time when things were so new that people were offended by it. We don't get offended by new works enough. We don't get shocked anymore. It's impossible to shock us. So it's fun to think about a time when you could still shock people. So you're welcome to read the summary of this opening night, and in the book that our optional reading comes from this week. Though, like I mentioned, it tends to distract audiences from the deeper themes of this work. Even though the audience was disturbed by the choreography more than the music, the scandal has also transferred to Stravinsky's score, which has morphed into a big bad avant-garde monster that's totally noisy and alienating beyond comprehension for a lay listener, an everyday listener who's not musically trained and has a PhD in musicology, like some assholes. So while Stravinsky's music is indeed noisy and cutting edge, it's by no means beyond comprehension, as we'll see today in our lecture. It's composed by a human for other humans to comprehend. So let's do that. So even if you've never looked at a musical score in your life before, there's no need to be worried. A score is basically a kind of line graph for a piece of music, a visual manifestation of the sonic part of the music. You can think of it as almost a graph, with the y-axis as pitch height. Each of these is an instrument, but on each respective instrument, the higher up we are physically on the page, the higher the note will be, and vice versa for lower. And then the x-axis is time and rhythm. So the contours of the melody will be traced out, almost like a population line graph. So even if you don't know what exact notes these are, you can think of this more as a visual aid in what we're listening to. Also, I'm going to play through and probably mostly sing through a lot of this of the themes that Stravinsky gives us here. So that'll give you you'll be able to match what's on the page with what I'm singing and what I'm playing. And then on top of that, after I do an analysis of each dance, I will give you the complete movement so you can hear it immediately after I've discussed that dance. And things will register much more quickly. You'll say, I'll remember when he said that. So if there are times you feel a little lost, just remember I'm going to play the music after I discuss each dance. So maybe things will start to click after I play it. So to begin with, this is the beginning of the ballet, and from the title of the piece, The Rite of Spring, or in French, Le Sacre du printemps, we know already that we're dealing with a rite. That is not right and left, but rite. That is a religious ritual or ceremony. It's the same root as ritual. And that it takes place at springtime, the rite of spring. Now, Stravinsky originally titled the first half, which here you see is called The Adoration of the Earth. He originally had the idea to just call it Day, or I think that was his working title. As he was working, he needed a way to refer to the first half, and he called it Day, and the second half was called Night. So this introduction to the Day section depicts the morning at sunrise, despite the fact that it may sound very alien to us on first listen, that it may sound more like a different planet than anything on Earth. But we have here an evocation of morning. But you can't think of it as something romantic and idyllic. It's something more primordial and ancient. Some dawn of the beginning of the world or something like that. So there's going to be quite a bit of chaos, just as there's actual chaos in real life nature. So this is the most famous theme of the Rite of Spring. This solo for bassoon. This is not a homophobic slur here. Fagotto is the Italian word for bassoon. I mentioned in another class that a bassoon is a double reed woodwind that's kind of related to the oboe, but it's much bigger. Well, Stravinsky is using a bassoon. He has a different instrument in mind. That he had a traditional Eastern European bagpipe in mind. Duda is one name for it, D-U-D-A, or dudka, D-U-D-K-A, depending on the language. This is a Slavic instrument, different variations on a bagpipe. I know you probably associate that with Scotland, but bagpipes exist wherever there are lots of sheep, because you take the sheep's guts and you make an instrument. I forget exactly if it's the stomach. I'm pretty sure it's the stomach of the sheep is what makes the bag, and then you attach pipes to it and you blow air not into the pipes but into the bag, and then you use your elbow to push down on the air in the bag, which you keep refilling, and then as you push down on the bag, air is pushed through the pipes, which you finger to create the different notes. So he actually very closely imitates the kind of grace notes and ornaments. That's these little notes that just decorate the main notes of the melody. And this type of playing, he's imitating actual bagpipe, actual duda and dudka playing. Stravinsky is also even imitating the drone of the bagpipe. You might have heard some in the background. So, like I said, when air is forced out of the bag into pipes, there are multiple pipes connected to the bag. One of those pipes you can change the pitch of, which is how you get the melody and these little grace notes, these little ornaments. But there are some pipes you can't control the pitch of, that they stay droning on the same pitch to provide a primitive harmony accompaniment to your melody, and I get a feeling that's what Stravinsky is imitating here as the horns enter and play these longer droning pitches. So this opening that's primarily for bassoon playing solo is something akin to Debussy's Afternoon of the Faun opening. That he's creating the sound of a folk instrument using a modern orchestral woodwind, just as Debussy was using the flute to imitate the panpipe. So while Debussy invented his own ancient music, this tune in Stravinsky's piece is an actual folk song from Lithuania. So it's not Russian, but Stravinsky likely included it in this ballet because it represents an ancient this ballet represents an ancient Eastern European past that's not tied down to any one specific sovereign nation, which would come along later. It was this kind of pan-Slavic vision of Russia and Eastern Europe. So he's looking beyond whether a folk tune is Russian, whether it's Lithuanian, or whether it's Ukrainian, and kind of scooping them all together and creating this pan-Slavic vision of the past. Now, Stravinsky had a big, thick book of Lithuanian folk melodies that he was drawing on, as well as I think he was also drawing on Rimsky-Korsakov's collections of Russian folk music. Though usually people focus on the Lithuanian ones because it's easier to identify which Lithuanian folk melodies he drew from that collection and insert it into his piece. If you're very interested in that, you should check out the scholarship of Richard Taruskin, Taruskin, who's the authority on Stravinsky's Russian-inspired music. But we can't go too far into it now. Though with this melody, because it's such an iconic melody, I was able to track down a folk group from some Lithuanian folk gals who are performing the original folk melody. So I'll play that for you here. You can see how how Stravinsky preserves the structure of folk music, which consists of short repeating motives called cells, like a biological cell. So here's let me play it for you. Let me play it without the grace notes. So you'll notice that there's this repeating cell, this da 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 da, and then there's a little bit of a different cell that occurs on the second measure where you get da da da, and then you get the first cell. Da, 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 da. So see how it's composed of these little tiny units that are almost modular that you repeat, and then you have a varying unit, and then you go back to the original unit, these cells. Now, Stravinsky's arrangement of the tune is also very rhythmically flexible to give the impression that a shepherd is improvising on his dudka. So that little da-da-da-da-da-da takes different rhythms. So in the first one, it's played on a quarter note, and then it's 4/16 notes, and one triplet, 1/8 note triplet. But in the third measure, it's all on what's called a quintuplet, 5 notes in one beat. So the rhythm is always varying. It's never exactly the same. Again, this is similar to the flexible improvisatory rhythm of Debussy's flute solo in The Afternoon of the Faun, which gave the impression that the faun was just absent-mindedly sitting there and playing on his panpipes. So the bassoon is answered by a similar melody in English horn at rehearsal number 2. That brings us to rehearsal numbers. These little numbers here are not measure numbers. This is measure 1, 2, 3, 4. Even though this is measure number 4, we use rehearsal numbers for larger chunks so that a conductor can say, okay, let's start at number 2. So that then the orchestra would know I'll start here. And they usually correspond to very important parts in the music. So this is an important part because a new melody has entered in the English horn. Cor inglese is the abbreviation, or cor anglais in French, English horn, which is a little bit of a lower version of an oboe, but not quite as big as a bassoon. So it's to instead of measure numbers, when you use rehearsal numbers, you say you can say 1 before 2. That would mean 1 measure before 2, or 2 measures after 2. So it'd be 1, 2. So it'd be this measure. So this bassoon melody, this dudka melody, is answered by the English horn melody, which sounds a little bit similar. That's that last little part here. This tune, however, is very repetitive, and so it sounds more like a bird. We keep getting this da, 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 this little da da da. It actually sounds a bit more like a bird than like a human tune. We're starting to see a breakdown in the difference between human music and folk music here. Birds in real life also sing short, repeated phrases that are reminiscent of repeating folk song cells. So what we're hearing here is perhaps a bird answering a shepherd's call. And Stravinsky seems to be showing us how close these primordial people are to nature, that they can play their music and nature will answer back to them, and it's hard to tell where nature begins and where the human music ends. So the oboes repeated D sharp at number 4, rehearsal 4. We need to go to the next page. The oboe enters here. This is definitely a bird call. It's isolated to one note like a bird. It's not like a melody. Little birdie there. An annoying birdie there. So aside from this string pizzicato here, again, this is plucked strings. There's this little interruption here. Aside from that little moment, we hear only woodwinds. Now, Stravinsky gradually starts to pile on independent instrumental voices in the woodwinds, which are each assigned their own melody or bird call. See how this line looks very different? This flute line looks very different from this flute line, which looks very different from this clarinet. And they gradually start to pile up. There's only about 1, 2, 3, and then this trill up here, but then we get more and more of these different calls, all playing different material. The orchestra, the woodwinds in the orchestra, they continue to pile up and get louder, imitating what's called the dawn chorus. That's the time of the early morning when all the birdies wake up and twitter at the same time. So it's got to have this element of chaos. Here you can see all these different lines. They all have different rhythmic and melodic characters, although some of those have the same rhythm there. Look at that one. I go. Some of them are real crazy, and then some of them are more incessant and loud. So at the loudest and busiest section, which is at rehearsal 11, this is rehearsal 10, and then see how the page is getting longer? There's more instruments here. They usually right here. Let me zoom out here. Look at this chaos. Oh my god. All these different, this twisting, churning, twittering assembly of all these different bird songs. In fact, there's about 20 different lines competing for attention. And I consider this one line because they're playing about the same melody and, as you can see, the same rhythm. So there's about 20 individual contrapuntal lines competing for attention. The easiest one to pick out, because the highest and the most shrill and piercing, is the flute, the piccolo flute. The full name is flauto piccolo, which means little flute, but we usually just refer to it as a piccolo, the highest of the flute family. Also, the piccolo trumpet, the smallest. That's another melody that's easy. That'll be easy for you to pick out. That's a tiny little version of a trumpet. So this is intentionally overwhelming. You should feel confused and overwhelmed when you listen to this. I know I mentioned this was about making sense of this piece, but this is indeed a moment that you're not supposed to make sense out of. It's intentionally overwhelming, like a wall of sound, but we should think of this as sounds of nature coming back to life in the spring. The scurrying, buzzing, chirping, cawing, they're not all birds. Some of these you might think of as a insect or some little squirrels digging at some nut or something. It doesn't really matter what they represent. You just can recognize them as kind of sounding like sounds from nature. But it's not something threatening. It is something awe-inspiring. It should overwhelm you and make you feel like just a little person compared to the overwhelming din of the forest that swirls around you, envelops you, and also makes you a part of it. So when you hear this part in the recording, just kind of let go and become part of nature. Imagine some psychedelic swirl of the forest surrounding you. But here, gets more crazy on this page. You get a lot of this, and it becomes almost overwhelming until... What's this? All those birdies and things drop out, and we come back to the bassoon solo. This is such a dramatic and gorgeous moment. And this cut off, and then leaving just this thin little for the bassoonist to arrive again and recapitulate his opening solo. It's almost like the diverse sounds of nature have reached their most chaotic and collapsed into this one folk song. That the melody this dudka in the form of a bassoon melody has that it encapsulates the spirit of nature, again showing us how these ancient people are closer to nature in their art. Now, I should point out that the curtain hasn't even risen at this point, or at least not in the original, Nijinsky's original production of the ballet. But the opening dance, which follows this introduction, actually overlaps with the end of the introduction. It's here, in the pizzicato against plucked violins. Here's what this little motive sounds like. And this is much more rhythmically definite compared to the previous free-flowing nature section. Now this, right here, in the violin, is an example of an ostinato in Italian, ostinato in American English, which is a word that's going to come up a lot in our analysis. So remember that word and learn what it is right now. I'm going to tell you. So an ostinato is also called a riff in popular music, and it's a short motive, or cell, is another word we've been using, a short motive or cell that repeats over and over, providing the rhythmic drive for a piece of music. It comes from the Italian word for obstinate in English, which means stubborn, and you'll see why in the next section, the next dance section. So after that intro, we get our first dance. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as Dance of Youths and Maidens. There's all sorts of different alternative titles to each of the sections. But here is another alternative title, The Augurs of Spring, and the Dances of the Young Girls. This one's a little bit more accurate because first we get the young men who are the augurs. They're learning the art of augury, which is of telling the future. And then halfway through the dance, the girls pop up to do their thing. So do you remember from the end of the last one, we had this little ostinato that went dum bum 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 bum. Let me find it again. Here it is. So that's that end of the introduction was actually giving a preview of this first dance. They're overlapping in a way. We won't get back to that until here, but we get another ostinato. These stabbing chords. So if the bassoon melody is the most famous melody from the Rite of Spring, this is the most famous rhythm and harmony from the Rite of Spring. What the strings are playing here. So this harmony that they're playing is called the augur's chord. Because during this dance, the young men of the village, like I mentioned, are taught the practice of augury, or divining the future, from an old lady. The chord is actually very similar in construction to that putrid harmony we heard at the end of Salome's monologue. Like that chord, this augur's chord is a combination of two harmonies that don't belong together. In Stravinsky's case, we have an F-flat major chord that sounds like this. It sounds nice on its own, right? But then he combines that with an E-flat 7 chord, which sounds like this. That one sounds fine on its own. It's a little bit foreboding. But now we combine those two. Imagine hearing that not just once, but dozens of times. While Strauss really allowed his dissonant chord to linger like some putrid, stinking carcass, Stravinsky treats his dissonant chord very percussively. That is, this harsh dissonance is alive with pounding, aggressive energy, and comes off like a drum beat because of its rhythmic treatment and the way the string players attack the chord. So we have a much less symmetrical rhythm here than in the previous ostinato, the one from the end, the last movement. That's a regular one, dun 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 dun, the symmetrical rhythm there. But this one has these accents that throw us off. We'll get to that in a second. I also wanted to point out what makes it so percussive sounding, even though it's strings playing, not drums, is that the strings, for one, they're playing forte, loud, but they're also playing exclusively on down bows. That is, the bow that they use to drag against the string to make the sound, they're only dragging it down. They're dragging it down on each individual note. So they bring it down, they lift again, drag it down to play the note, lift again, drag it down to play the note, instead of doing an up bow, where they would drag the bow upward over the string. Every single time it's a down bow. they're allowing the heavy force of gravity to fall on each note. But then, as I mentioned, it becomes even more stab-like and percussive when these accents come in. See these little greater than signs? That's an accent. It means this one should be played with greater force. And on top of that, he adds the horns play these corni horns. They come in. They correspond with the accents that the string players are adding. Now, the accents seem to be totally random, but there's actually a logic to them. At least in this section with 3 beats. Where is it? Here it is. Okay, so this section right here. So we have an accent. That accent shows a group of 3. 1, 2, 3. Then we have another accent, and we get a group of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then another accent, and a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then an accent, and it kind of throws things off. We get a group of 3. But that little section in the middle there, this dun 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 dun, where we get 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 1, 2, 3. We might call that an additive rhythm. He adds an extra beat each time. But since we as an audience can't pick up on this, this little addition equation that's going x plus 1, we don't, unless we have a score in our hand. It sounds totally random to us. It's totally unexpected and lurching, and that's why this music can be very disturbing, because we don't have someone telling us, okay, on the next measure expect 1 more. We're expecting there to be 3 in each group or 4 in each group, so it would sound more like, if it were more regular sounding, it would be like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That wouldn't be so bad. Or even if it was 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But no, this is what we get. 1, 2, 3. You'd have no idea when they're going to fall. And so that's what throws you off and disturbs you in a way. Every once in a while I want to explain what's going on in Nijinsky's choreography, and so I'll mention here that the youths who are going to learn the art of augury, these young men of the tribe are hopping in a circle on their tippy toes, and they hop to the rhythm of each down bow stroke, but every time there's an accent, they strike a pose, and they're kind of grotesque, almost cubist-looking poses with the arms at strange angles. It's all very pointy and Picasso-looking. So this section breaks off at this repetition of the augur chord breaks off at number 14, and the English horn enters with that original ostinato. This one. Dun, dun. And it's accompanied by this mischievous little bassoon arpeggio. It's like, the bassoon has this great, almost fat sound. It's like bulbous almost. But then, so that happens for 4 measures. We get but then all of a sudden, we go back to the pounding augurs chord right here. But then at 15, those 2 different ostinati, that's the plural of ostinato. You can say ostinatos, or if you want to be pretentious and sound Italian, you say ostinati. So this ostinato, the augurs chord ostinato, and this ostinato, the bum 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 ostinato, we'll call it that, we'll just sing it, they combine finally at 15. You can see the English horn continues playing, and the augur chord continues there. It's also at this point that we get our first snippet of an actual melody. It's not something that's not an ostinato, but that's a theme, and that's in the oboe and the solo trumpet. This da, 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 da. That was the trumpet part. I'll play it again. Da, 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 da. It's not an ostinato, it's a theme, a melody. Now this is how this piece is going to progress. That what we've seen so far in this dance, that the ostinatos will be established. Stravinsky will establish those ostinati, and then they will accompany, kind of back off and accompany melodies that will emerge on top of the ostinati. For instance, next we'll hear this swirling piccolo flute melody. That's another melody that arrives right here. And very often the melodies and the ostinati will kind of vie for power. The ostinato will back off and the melodies will come to the forefront, but then the ostinato will say, no, not on my watch. So that's what happens here. You get the swirling flute melody that's up here. See flute piccolos and regular flutes, and then alto flutes, which are a larger version of the flute. So they play their swirling melody, but then look who takes over. Dum, bum, 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 bum. So this ostinato says, that's the not on my watch. So this ostinato had disappeared, and it's reasserting itself here to bring a sense of order. It also sets us up for another folk tune at 19, a big fat bassoon right here. So our rhythmic equilibrium has already been thrown off by that stabbing rhythm, the auger chord rhythm with these abrupt and erratic accents. But we can see here how the accents in this new melody are regularly on the offbeat. So that's the downbeat, and then we get an offbeat. This is the part I love. Stravinsky tricks us into thinking that this accented beat is the strong beat, that this is the downbeat right here, when in reality there's a rest where the downbeat should be. But we don't know that's a rest because we're so thrown off that we think the measure starts here, that this on this beat is where the measure starts because that's where it's accented. But then that means that once he does go back to normal and places the accent where it should be on the downbeat of this measure, there's a little hiccup, a strange little on this accented downbeat that's placed right next to an accented offbeat here. I'm slowing it down, but feel that little hiccup again? Let me do it again. So what happens during that hiccup is that Stravinsky is reestablishing the first beat in the measure as the strong beat, whereas before it was on the off beats 2 and 4 instead of 1 and 3. It was now he's reestablishing this as the strong beat. Dun 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 da 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 dum. You get that little hiccup there. So this tune is repeated at 21. That is rehearsal number 21, in what's called a canon. More commonly, you may have heard it called a round. That's when two instruments play the same melody, but with one leading the other, that they're staggered, like row, row, row your boat or Frere Jacques. In this case, the statements of the tune are staggered at the space of 2 measures. See how this one starts, and then 2 measures later, so in the bassoon, they start here, and then 2 measures later, the oboe enters with the same melody. I really love how Nijinsky treats this in his choreography. So this is when the young men start to learn augury from this old lady in a squirrel fur. She teaches the young men how to tell the future using bundles of sticks that she throws on the ground, and then you read the shape of the sticks. So at this part, she nods her head. This is the old lady right here in the bassoons. She nods her head with the first voice of the canon, and then the youths, the young men, nod their heads on the second voice up here, the oboes. So there's a choreographic approximation of this question and answer form of the canon, that the canon has this one, and then the oboe continues there, enters staggered, and while the first voice continues. Nijinsky has a choreographic approximation of that. So the structure, the form of the music is visualized on stage in the choreography. I love that. Now after that, we get to this huge dramatic gesture right before 22 that's marked by this pounding timpani. And the timpani are these big kettle drums. You have a few of them, and they're all at different pitches. and they are one of the more aggressive instruments in Stravinsky's score. And so you get this pounding timpani descending motive here, where everything cuts off very loudly. Now you better get used to these kinds of moments because they appear throughout the rite of spring, and contribute to its violent character. I like to think of the rite as a kind of mosaic or a collage that's composed of a million little pieces of paper or of broken tiles, let's say, and each little moment sounds like it's cut from a separate bit of folk song cloth or ostinato cloth. Now at moments like this cutoff, we're hearing the ripped or jagged edges where the pieces are stuck next to one another. They don't fit smoothly and nicely, but we have big gaps and frayed edges between them, like at this moment. So after this big cutoff on the next page, at 22, we get a return of this regular rhythm ostinato. This bum 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 bum. You can see that in the English horn. So that reestablishes itself, which prepares us for another folk tune that's divided between the solo horn. I think it's on the next page. Yes, between the solo horn and the solo flute. Yeah, here's where the solo flute take, and here's how it starts off in the horn. But then it's taken exclusively by the flute. See, the flute responds and takes the second half of the melody. You'll hear it in the recording. But then it's taken exclusively by the flutes at 27. There's some filler material, and then here it is again in the flutes. It's in a different key, it looks like. This passage brings us to an absolutely magical little section at 28. Here. Where the flutes are continuing their melody over the main ostinato. You can see dum ba da dum bum bum ba da dum bum 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 ba da da dum bum bum ba. They continue their melody over the main ostinato. That is the bum 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 bum. That's in the trombones, the strings, and the timpani. This section is later joined by the triangle and the crotales in the next section. Here we go, triangle and antique cymbals, which are also called crotales, which are tiny little metal cymbals. So this happens at 29. You get these bing, bing of the triangles and the crotales, the antique cymbals. And it makes this vivid sparkling effect like water droplets. So this is a softer and more, like I said, more magical section that's supposed to accompany the entrance of the girls. Remember I said this is the dance of the augurs and then dances of the young girl. So out of this texture emerges something very subtle that I want to point out here in the trumpets, which we might actually mistake for an ostinato. Let me play it for you. Again, that's right here. Let me play it again. See how you might think that's an ostinato because it's so repetitive and you get this da dun da repeating dum bum bum. On this point of this kind of ambiguity between whether this is an ostinato or whether it's a melody, it's worth observing now that in this piece, a melody can very easily become an ostinato by isolating one of its cells, as we're about to see happen very soon. So there's a little bit of a development of the ostinatos that we've heard and new appearances of the flute theme, including at 30. I'm flipping through several pages quickly. A lot of the same things happens over and over. So at 31, we get the reappearance of the flute theme. This. And I'm not playing the grace notes just so you can hear what it sounds like easier. That theme reappears in the piccolos. But then at 32, you can see how for two measures, right here, For two measures, Stravinsky treats the first three notes of that theme that we just heard in the piccolo. He treats that as if it were an ostinato. Look here. Dun da da dun da da dun da da dum. He just repeats that little cell over and over. Again, let me go back. This is how this section of the melody really sounds like. And I'm cutting out the grace notes. That's a melody. That's something you can sing and put on your and put words to in a song. But what he does later is he takes this part, these three notes, ignore the grace notes, he takes those three notes here and just repeats them over. Dun da da dun da da dun da da dun da da. And it becomes an ostinato. He isolates that little folk music cell of the melody, and instead of using it melodically, he uses it like an ostinato. But then we should point out that he continues with the rest of the melody. So you get, let me see if I can do this with two hands. Dun da da dun da da dun da da dun da da. And on the next page, dun da dun da da dun dun. So the melody then spins out to what it should have been. But we get this little broken record moment where we're stuck on that little ostinato, that little cell of a melody, so that it becomes an ostinato. Hope that makes sense. So you can see how easily a theme becomes an ostinato, and vice versa, how an ostinato can become a theme. And these themes are intentionally modular, that they can be broken up into little cells that can be repeated as an ostinato, or that they can be joined together with other cells to form a melody. You see that? They're almost like Legos. They're like little Legos that you can organize in different orders, or you can have the same exact Lego piece over and over, or you can insert other Lego pieces between them and get some fun patterns. At any rate, this passage launches into this return of this flute melody. This launches into a big swirling finale that's dominated by the main theme that we've been hearing, this dum ba da dum bum bum ba da dum. You can see how all the instruments are playing here. Sorry, some sections I just have to go through quickly and say things go crazy here because we're a little pressed for time. But you'll hear it see here, look, here's in the flute, dun da da dun da. So that theme dominates to the end of this section. I'll just flip through. You can see things go crazy, and then this is the end. Yep, that's the end of that movement. So let's listen to this section. So I had originally planned to give you first I was going to give you an overview of every single movement. That soon proved itself an impossibility, so I was going to do a few select movements. And then I soon realized that even if I just selected some dances, and I had about 6 dances selected, that would total to about a 3-hour lecture video, which I don't want to subject you to. And it soon became clear that if you want to know the score, you kind of have to sit down and listen to it yourself, or else listen to me for several hours. I'd rather let you figure it out on your own instead of listening to my nasally voice. So I highly recommend you look at our required reading for this week, which is Gillian Moore's Rite of Spring is the title of it, The Music of Modernity. It's written for people who aren't music experts, and but it's done very intelligently, and it's never pandering or juvenile. But she has a chapter in there that goes dance by dance and gives you the high points of those sections. And then in the following chapter, it's titled something like "What was so new about the Rite?" That tells you about the musical innovations that I've only been able to touch on a little bit in this lecture. So if you're excited and inspired by this work, do check those out. You gotta do some work on your own. I'm sorry, I can't do it all for you. But on that note, I will mention, if once you've done some exploring, and let's say you want to do some choreography for one of the dances, I would recommend you only choose one. The ones that I would recommend you choose are Spring Rounds, or the Ritual Action of the Ancestors. These two tend to have, the rhythms aren't quite so complicated and asymmetrical as some of the others, like these the Augurs of Spring that we looked at. But once you have selected one or two movements that you'd like to choreograph or do some sort of staging with, I would be more than happy to sit down with you one-on-one and look at the music, because I've taken copious notes on each one, and I can break it down for you. One thing I will mention, why this might be a good idea for you to do, is that if you are a dancer, you're used to 8 counts. You know, right? Everybody ready? 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2. Grand jeté, jazz square. You know, you have these 8 counts that you follow, and that's how you count dances that are set to pop music or jazz, or traditional classical ballet. You cannot do an 8 or a 12 count to the Rite of Spring. There are some sections where you may be able to do that, but not for very long, as we've seen. So you might be able to figure that out on your own, like I said, just from looking at the meter, but there are all sorts of complicated, twisted rhythms that I would be happy to sit down with you, either in person in my office, if you feel comfortable doing that, or over Zoom. But for today's purposes, we're only going to hit the very high points at the very beginning and the very end of the ballet. So we've looked at the introduction, which is not a dance, remember. I would not recommend choreographing that, as you've seen how complicated that is, and not much rhythmic drive. But we looked at the first dance, and we're going to look at the last dance, the most important dance, the sacrificial dance. I will mention, though, a little bit about the middle dances, which you should look at in the choreography. One striking and unusual aspect is these games. So this is a ritual abduction, but in the French title is actually jeu, game of abduction. And then ritual of the rival tribes, which is also a game. So they seem like the boys and girls are just having fun, but the games that they're playing actually represent very disturbing things. So the ritual of abduction represents something called bride kidnapping, which was this horrible practice, still practiced today by some peoples around the world, but more so in ancient times, including amongst the Slavs, where they would go into villages, often on horseback. They'd go into someone else's village, pick up a woman, and take her home, and she is forced to marry you because of the shame of being kidnapped, and you're in a new place, and you belong to that man now. It's a game, though. The boys and girls of the tribe are pretending to do it. Same with the Ritual of Rival Tribes is a game where the boys do it's more a sport. It's the boys do wrestling matches and the girls sit on the sidelines and in flirtatious little poses and watch the with admiration. They watch the boys or they giggle with each other. But again, it's representing actual battles that would occur between these rival tribes, and this one really hits home nowadays since we see two Slavic people poised at their border, the Ukrainian Russian border. So this one has very disturbing present day application. But most of these the game, we'll get to another game eventually, but I just want to point out that in the first half the tribes people are preparing the earth. There's this amazing scene where the sage, this shaman, the spiritual leader of the tribe, enters and kisses the earth, not releases this ghostly presence in the form of these string harmonics, the strange chord in the strings you produce by just pressing lightly on the string, and this produces this flute-like, eerie, almost electronic sound. This, and then that unleashes the power of the earth in the final dance of the first section. So that's the first half, the adoration of the earth, preparing the earth for the sacrifice in the second half. This is a female-dominated movement with the female dancers being the main dancers, and they play their own game. So the boys have had their fighting game. They have a game based on the horovod. Remember, these round dance. That happens in the mystic circles of the young girls. So it seems like a pleasant game. We've had these two violent, masculine energy, a rape game and a violence game, a war game, and now it seems we have something a little bit more pleasant in the female domain, which is this. It is actually rather picturesque the way that Nijinsky choreographs it. He has they're doing a horovod, they're doing a round dance. The girls are, and every other girl, so they count off 1 2 1 2. All the ones in the circle don't do anything. They just march in the circle and keep going forward. The every other girl, the twos, if you count off 1 2 1 2, the two girls do this weaving in and out, where every measure or so they skip ahead of the one girls, the girls who aren't doing anything, and they weave in and out, so you get this lovely like a braid almost. This circle that's braiding in itself. It's hard to describe. Just watch the video. But it's this lovely, pleasant little game. But then all of a sudden, one of the girls falls over. It's a weird detail to put into a ballet. That it's not a comic moment. You would do that with a clown character in traditional ballet, but to do it with one of your female dancers within the context of a pleasant girls dance, round dance, that's weird. So and Stravinsky's music has this little like motive that's like, and all the music pauses. So you think, okay, that's weird. Let's keep going though. They keep doing their dance. They weave in and out of each other, and then it happens again to the same girl, and the Stravinsky's little motive gets louder and louder and louder, and it gets out of control, and it leads to this crazy glorification of the chosen one. So this girl who's fallen twice, she has been chosen by the gods, by Yarilo or whoever, to be the chosen one. So it's a little bit of a duck duck goose kind of game. She's the chosen one, but it's not so pleasant as duck duck goose. She is the one who will be sacrificed after we've prepared the earth. Now the earth desires blood in order for spring to come. So she is the virgin sacrifice. It is very disturbing that they use this little child's game, or a variation on a child's game, and a variation on a pleasant horovod dance to select through pure chance the person who falls over twice and then is going to have to dance herself to death. That really amps up the kind of disturbing atmosphere of this ballet. So she's ritually prepared. She's glorified. Then we have to get the ancestors on board. We summon their spirits. There's a lot in lots of traditional cultures all over the world. They engage in ancestor worship. The most interesting thing is that in the staging there are 6 elders who enter in bear skins. And they also represent ancestors, but this is another way of emphasizing how close these ancient people are to nature, that they view their most ancient ancestors as bears, as animals, as that they have descended from nature, that they're not separate as humans. As humans, they're not separate from nature, but rather a part of nature, and that their own ancestors were animals. So that's what's happening in these two. They summon the ancestors, including having some elders represent the oldest of the ancestors. So now that's the chosen one, who has been standing in the middle, terrified, in this, her feet turned in, her fists clenched and held at her sides, holding perfectly still, like a statue, because she's terrified. She has been prepared. The ancestors are on board, and it's time for her to do her thing. That's where the sacrificial dance begins. Before we get to that, though, I bet you've been dying to know how I'm going to insert the attendance link, and here it is. I've made it look like first of all, I chose my favorite movement of the Rite of Spring, the ritual action of the ancestors. It's so creepy, mysterious, hypnotizing. The English horn and the alto flute, this lower version of the flute, play this incantation, almost like a spell, like one of the shamans of the tribe is muttering under his breath some magic words to summon the ancestors. That's what the music reminds me of. Like I mentioned, this would be a good place to do to start for one of your, if you want to choreograph the piece. Unfortunately, we can't get to it today, but it looks like I've analyzed it here in great detail. This is all nonsensical. These letters don't mean anything. They're the code for the attendance survey. So remember, it's always starts with https://// and like always, I always say you could probably leave that off. I've never actually seen if you can leave it off. So someone let me know if it can. Let me know in the comments. No, I turned the comments off because I don't care what you kids think. So https:/// forms, the word forms, .gle, as in the last three letters of the word Google, / and then these letters, I've underlined the lowercase letters, and you read them like that, okay? And for those of you who are hard of seeing, I'll read through it once. So lowercase w as in water, uppercase D as in dog, lowercase o as in octopus, uppercase X as in xylophone, lowercase v as in Victoria, uppercase Z as in zebra, uppercase Y as in yellow, lowercase x as in xylophone, uppercase B as in Bart Simpson, lowercase b as in Bart Simpson, uppercase E as in Edward, uppercase S as in Samantha, uppercase R as in Richard, lowercase c as in Cadigan, my last name, in case you were wondering how it's pronounced, the number 7 as in 7 deadly sins, lowercase e as in Edward, and the number 8, the digit 8. Also, I wanted to point out this is not B flat, although it looks like B flat. It's uppercase B and lowercase b, but serendipitously, there was a B flat. I thought that I was so clever doing that. Let's watch the chosen one dance herself to death. Well, we're not going to watch her. You're going to listen to me explain what's going on as she dances herself to death. This is exciting. So, at the end of the ritual action of the ancestors, the movement before the sacrificial dance, there's the slinking bass clarinet figure. It's kind of like the inverse of that Salome run. It's going down instead of up, and it slithers down like that onto the downbeat of the first measure of the sacrificial dance. Where does it land? You can see it land here. And when it does that, it lands on this low E. That pitch acts as a kind of trigger. It's instantly answered by a stabbing chord in the strings. And then there's this brief pause. You can see this rest with a fermata that holds the rest. So you've got this pregnant pause. There's a brief pause before we launch into the sacrificial dance. Let me play that moment right there. Pause. This chord is fantastic. It's a lot like the augur's chord in that it's kind of two harmonies combined. The lower end of it, you get an E flat chord without the third, if that makes sense to any of you who know any music. It's based on an E flat chord. Let's put it that way. It's not E flat major or E flat minor. It's missing the third, the middle pitch. It's this open fifth, but it's based on E flat. The upper part of the chord is a D7 chord. That's a common chord you'll hear in music. But again, we combine those two things and it's incredibly dissonant and percussive, just like the what do you call it? The augur's chord. Let me do it again. It's great. So then you get this pregnant pause before we launch into the sacrificial dance. The dance that the chosen one, surrounded by a circle of these bearskin elders, will dance for us. So she gets into this power stance that I love. She moves her right leg back, and her right arm is held straight up above her head in a fist, while her left arm is held out perpendicular to her body in a fist. So she makes this kind of 90-degree angle. It looks like something from like Dragon Ball Z or something. So she steels herself to perform what will be the last performance of her life. In this ritual, she will dance herself until she expires from exhaustion, her sacrifice ensuring the arrival of spring and a plentiful harvest. Now, I know I keep saying, this isn't some strange extraterrestrial dance, it's human. And there's many human and natural elements that we've already seen in this piece already, and showing man's connection to nature, especially in the first movement with the shepherds. The free-flowing shepherd's melody is connected with the sounds of nature. But this is where things start to get more mechanical and inhuman, and purposefully so. We'll see that there's a reason for that. So many commentators have noted that Stravinsky's rhythms in The Bride of Spring and in this number particularly in the sacrificial dance are mechanical. It's as if the chosen one has ceased to be a person and is purely a mechanical automaton, like a robot, performing this dance. And indeed, we can see the real-world significance of this, as only a year later, in 1914, almost exactly a year later is when World War I starts. Wouldn't be World War I, it would be the Great War for them. Only a year after this premiere, young men would be sent out to fight in this horrible conflict, where human bodies were joined with tanks and airplanes for the first time in modern warfare to become like mechanical hybrid beings, sent out to kill, and most of them to be killed. Again, the Great War hadn't begun yet at the premiere of this ballet. So Stravinsky is actually being very prescient in his depiction of people, young people, being dehumanized and treated like automatons. But Stravinsky, even though he hadn't seen this war begin yet, he seems to understand the way that modernization is going, how it's transforming humans into mere tools. So even if he hadn't seen that in warfare, industrialization had reduced the workers in the early 20th century to just another piece of machine in a factory that they can be easily replaced and switched out when they're old, the older workers wear out. So with his mechanical music for this dance, for the sacrificial dance, Stravinsky seems to be telling us that our supposedly enlightened society, though modernized, isn't so different from the so-called primitive society on display. We, like our primitive ancestors, continue to devalue human life and are willing to sacrifice the individual in favor of the collective. Whether that's a superstitious belief system that demands blood for the return of spring, or a modernized bureaucracy that chews up the little people on the bottom. And again, as we've mentioned, another year after this premiere, modern society would become even closer to this primitive one, as young people were sent out sacrificially by their elders, these old men who had their political squabbles between these old aristocrats and war leaders, but they weren't the ones who were being sacrificed. It was the young people who were sacrificed. And these young people did so willingly, like our chosen one in this ballet, who understands that she has to submit to the will of the gods and of her elders. It's that willingness that disturbs us as an audience. For our musical and analytical purposes here, though, this mechanical comparison, though it has some chilling extra musical implications, it's actually a pretty useful metaphor for understanding this dance, which is incredibly complicated at first, but you'll see how it actually follows a very mechanical pattern. So there are three motives, three cells, each with a strong melodic and rhythmic character. And we can think of these cells as little machine parts, and we're going to call them, the first one we'll call them a piston. If you don't know what these machine parts are, look them up. It's important to know what these things are, just to know how a car works. A piston, a gear, and a car horn. You'll see why I call those them in a second. So this opening section of the dance keeps switching between these three machine parts, as if they were being fitted together in a predetermined order on an assembly line, or are participating in a chain reaction within a big machine, like a car. So the piston is the busiest of the three motives, and I call it that because it chugs along, just like a mechanical piston. The score is very, very complicated visually here, so we're actually going to not look at the upper part of the score, but just focus on the bottom half of this opening. It's best to concentrate on just the strings here. If you aren't for sure, these are violins, the violas, the cellos, violoncelli, cellos, and contrabasses, the double basses. So we'll look at them, plus the timpani, because they're the ones that are outlining the rhythm most obviously. So this rhythm is launched by the basses. The main part of the main stabbing chords, which are we looked at the chord already, that very dissonant chord like the augur's chord, is in the rest of the strings, and it's punctuated by the timpani, which also is kind of like so these are like the triggers, the bass and the timpani, and they trigger the stabbing chords. Again, this little symbol means they're down bows, letting gravity carry the bow down onto the strings. So here's what it sounds like. Hear that? So that's the piston, all right? Again, I'll show you on here. Bum, 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 where the timpani and the bass are launching the rhythm and then keeping it going up here. So this piston is followed by what I call the gear here. The gear is played on the strings, playing all down bows. Again, this little symbol means a down bow. And I call this the gear because it has three descending chords. Well, these are thick chords, and I'm only going to play you the top note, which sounds like this. Again. So I call this the gear because it has three descending pitches that remind me of the turning the turning teeth of a gear as they click into place. You could imagine that the piston motive has generated the energy to turn the gear motive. So the piston, you can see how similar this returns again. The piston returns at 143, rehearsal number 143, and then at 144, again, we get another gear. I should have mentioned that. Then at 144, we get our least common machine part, which I'm calling the car horn, because all the winds join in fortissimo. We've been dealing primarily with the strings, and the strings are still playing for this third motive, but the winds join in here. You can see all these woodwinds and brass. So they join in at fortissimo in this part, and it gives the sound of an old-fashioned klaxon horn, one of those awooga horns, you know. So you could imagine in our metaphor that the gear, that gear, has turned enough to allow our car to start rolling. We want to tell people to get out of the way, so we honk our awooga horn. And here's what the car horn sounds like. I'm just gonna play the top note. Again. So after the car horn, bam, 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 you can see we get another piston. Ja, ja, ja. Then look, a gear. And then another, oops, sorry. And then another car horn. And the process continues similarly. I'll mention here that in his choreography, Nijinsky followed this mechanical process in the music by assigning each of the three mechanical motives a unique movement. Again, it's a little bit like that canon that I mentioned with the old lady, where the old lady nods and the boys nod in response, following the musical structure and visualizing it through the choreography. Nijinsky does the same thing here. So the piston motive, again, the this piston part is a jump straight up in the air. Again, this is the chosen one dancing. She jumps straight up in the air with her legs folded up under her while she's in the midair. For the gear, it sounds like when I do it, it sounds like from Family Guy, Peter Griffin. If you can call it the Peter Griffin motive if you want. So for the gear, she turns to the right. She's planted on the ground. She's not in the air anymore. So she turns to her right. She plants her left leg behind her, and she leans backward a little and lifts her right arm straight out and angled upward while bringing her left arm up to her breast. The whole movement looks like she's shooting a bow and arrow that she's aiming upward at 45 degrees. Again, you should look at the videos to get a sense of what these look like, but I just wanted to describe them to you. Now the car horn, again, sorry. Dun, 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 ha, ha. Again, Peter Griffin, sorry. The car horn motive is a leap in the air, but only the left leg folds up beneath the chosen one. At the same time, she lifts her right arm and shakes it a little, like she's waving with her fist or celebrating a soccer goal. It has this kind of triumphant attitude to it. So again, you really get a visual sense of the musical structure in this dance, which Nijinsky follows so closely with his choreo. Because Nijinsky has assigned upward leaps to two out of the three motives, that is the piston and the car horn, you mostly see the poor dancer portraying the chosen one. You mostly see her leaping over and over in place, like she's jumping rope. It's an absolutely exhausting and tortuous dance, and intentionally so, since this has to be a dance that would believably drive the chosen one to death. So this development of machine parts in the music and in the choreo continues with this great, at one point you'll get this great timpani solo that starts here at 146. So pay it, boom, 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 boom. This is very kind of random sounding timpani solo until 149. So that continues. Sorry, I gotta, oh, that was 149. Gotta skip over some sections quickly. When it suddenly cuts off, you can see this double bar shows the cutoff and this rapid chord there. And we get a very quiet stop and start ostinato in the strings, bassoons, and horn. It's a very, very difficult ostinato to count, even though it looks simple. That's because it's always changing between beat groupings of 2 and 3 in the meter. So look here. This is what I mentioned, that you can't force an 8 count on this, kids. You get a 3/8 measure, a 2/8 measure, then 2/8, 2/8, 2/8, 2/8, 3/8, 2/8. See how it's switching back and forth. It's not regular 4/4 bars, and that's going to throw your ear off. So here's what it sounds like. I have to sing it so I can switch the page. Bum bum rest, bum rest, bum 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 rest, bum rest, bum rest, bum bum rest, bum 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 rest, bum rest, bum bum rest. If you're interested, there's a video on YouTube where they treat the sacrificial dance like a Dance Revolution, where you have to clap along. It's very, very difficult to do. It's fun. It's a hilarious video. They do all these fun editing effects to make it look like the Dance Revolution videos. But this is all done very, very quietly. We've gotten this very loud section already with the mechanical section, but look, we're pianissimo, very, very quiet. And in this piece, we've been conditioned to be suspicious of any passage that's too quiet, because we know something loud is surely coming to jump out at us. And sure enough, there's this blaring trombone fanfare at 151. It's this great interruption, like a jump scare in a horror movie. And it repeats, and it's echoed here. It repeats again in the trombone, and it's echoed in the trumpets and the piccolo trumpet. So then the stop and start motive, this one switching between 2/8 and 3/8, this continues very quietly until 154. See how it keeps going? Continues there, where we jump from pianissimo to these forte attacks. And Stravinsky also doubles the rhythm. He had been doing that in some instruments, like the horns, but most of them, see how they play double? Da-dum, da-dun, da-dun. And most of them are just playing one, dun, dun. But now all the instruments are doing this double. Da-dun, 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 da-dun. And the string players are playing two bowing strokes where they had been playing one, and it creates this jittery, nervous sensation. Like things are getting intense, folks. The fanfares continue to punctuate. Here we go, da 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 da. And leading us to 159, 56. See, it continues. Da 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 da. 158 and 150. You can even see visually on the page. Look, there's not much going on. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, everyone's coming in. The whole orchestra joins in on the ostinato, leading to a wild climax at 160. Look at that. Look at that. My God. Leads to this wild climax. Lots of screaming. Is there piccolo? Always some screaming piccolo. There it is. It's playing the da 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 that crazy fanfare. But then, as always, we know that things never stay too crazy or too quiet for too long, and we instantly break off here and go back to the quiet 3/8/2/8 ostinato. Very quiet. Dies down and goes back to pianissimo as well, or piano here, I guess. So the ostinato goes through another process of intensification. We've already intensified it once, and we're going to go through that process again. Because we have this new whirling figure in the flutes and the first violins at 165. See this kind of whirling figure? I'm not going to try and sing it. You'll hear it on the recording. Which provides the momentum, which brings us to 167. More whirling. Brings us to 167. Look here. Oh my gosh. What's that? It's the pistons. So we come back to the mechanical music. It starts up again. We get a piston. We get, what's this? A gear. Then we get another piston. And then a gear again. And what's that? That's a car horn. Thanks, Peter Griffin. You're welcome. So the choreography, what's been going on? The chosen one has been shivering with fear during the previous part when we had the quiet motive. She hasn't been doing her leaps anymore during this ostinato. She's been shivering with fear. But as soon as we return to the mechanical music, she gets a hold of her emotions and returns to the power stance, and so that she can launch into all her hopping again. And she goes back into those three moves that correspond to the three motives. So you know how this works now, even though I've gone through it over and over again. There's little change to the process. At 174, Stravinsky breaks off of the mechanical music and introduces this very elephantine ostinato. So the trombones are playing a glissando. Remember, we had harp glissandi where you just pull your finger or thumb along the strings to get that. You can do it on other instruments, but it doesn't sound quite so fairy-like, especially on the trombone. You all know this from big band music or jazz band music. It sounds like an elephant, right? So this it shows you where Stravinsky shows which note he should start from, and then he pulls in his slide. That's what that thing is called, and then he pulls it up to this note. So the trombone plays his glissando, and each of the downbeats of this unusual 5/4 measure, not unusual for Stravinsky, but for regular classical music, very unusual. And then that's answered by this barrage, this clanging barrage of percussion, including tam-tam, which is a giant gong. Use that, man. Yep, tam-tam. Which really reverberates in this noisily and very metallic in this section. So this section has, and then there you get other the timpani, and this stands for gran casa, which means a bass drum. So this section really has a warlike feel to it, since this is the last battle for the chosen one, who's beginning to feel exhaustion set in. So it continues here. See all this percussion playing, tam-tam, bass drum, timpani. So the warlike atmosphere continues with this series of fanfare-like motives, mostly divided between the horns and the trumpets. Let me see if I can find those. Horns, and those are trombones. Here's some trumpets there. So in the brass, these give the impression of war cries or war fanfares, and these carry us over to 180. Sorry, I got to skip ahead. What do we get? We get the mechanical music again. So this picks up the machine process, but only momentarily. This is very short-lived. Look at this. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 measures of the machine music, and then the elephant music comes back in again. See, trombone, glissando, and all the percussion clanging. So the warlike music in the choreography represents the chosen one abandoning the dance again. She collapses and pounds her fists on the ground, and then she gets up, but shows us that her legs have grown stiff and stop working. She locks her legs and grabs onto them and pulls them to the side to show, you see in this, I can't keep going. It's as if she's pleading that she can't go on. Not that she doesn't want to go on. The will still drives her. This rhythm still drives her. She's showing that she physically cannot dance anymore. But we're close to the end, and the dancer has to set her mind on this self-destructive, suicidal goal, and starts the final leg of the dance in earnest now. So this little section here, she's trying to go back. She can't. She shows us she can't, back with the elephant music. But now at 186, more elephant music. So at 186, she assumes the power stance, and we return to the machine music. But it's more regularized now, without all the sporadic changing amongst the three machine parts in seemingly random order. Now there are passages with a regular alternation between the piston and the gear. That is the ja and the ha ha ha. Like at 190, skip ahead, 189, 190 to 191 plus 2. This section here, we see that let me go down to the strings. We get 3 exact repetitions of a chain of pistons and a gear. See that? There's a sense that this machine is finally working the way it's supposed to, as if we've gotten into a groove. And now that it's working correctly, we trigger a new machine part right before 193. Look at that. What is this? Let me play it for you. It's a C major chord, but it's not so pleasant. It's more threatening within this context. So this is a totally new motive that's added to the mechanical process. It's an ascending 3-note figure that's a little like the gear motive, but it's inverted. It's upside down. It's ascending instead of descending, like the gear. We could even think of this like a gear shift or a gear reversal, that the gear motive wasn't going the right way before, but now that the machine music has gotten in its groove in a more regular alternation between motives, that the gear is turning the direction it should, that it was actually supposed to go upward, not downward. So in the choreo, Nijinsky responds to the new motive, as you'd expect, with a new move for the dancer. This gear shift, as I'll call it, is paired with spins that alternate outward to the right and to the left. So this gear shift motive and Nijinsky's accompanying spin move, these turn out to be the coup de grace, the final kiss of death that finally wears the chosen one out completely. So she gives us 8 last hops into the air. Let me show you how this progresses. Bum, 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 bum. Continues more of this new ascending motive, this gear shift. And throughout that section, she gives us 8 last hops in the air, the chosen one does, and then collapses with this English horn trill right here. And then she tries to get up with the rising flute figure here in the alto flutes and the regular flutes. She tries to get up. She lifts her head and her legs slightly before completely falling limp. And it's this amazing gesture that's almost like, it almost looks like she's levitating in some versions of the choreography. And then she can't get up again. She dies. She lets her legs and her head fall back down, and she dead. She falls completely limp. And the elders then move in, the elders in the bear costumes. It's a very creepy scene where they all move in and lift her body in time to this screeching gesture, and yet another flute piccolo screeching gesture. And the whole ensemble leaps forward with this final thud in the horns, the brass, the bass drum, the timpani, and the low strings. So let's give that a listen. that will conclude our lecture today. I hope this has gotten you excited about this music, and to show you that there is a logic to it. That's what's so interesting about this final movement, that we've started from the beginning of the ballet, from the natural world, and we get a musical progression of almost a progression of human history from the pre-modern world, the natural world, to this modernized world of where man puts his imposes his order on nature and onto himself and destroys his own kind. While we have changed, we haven't changed that much. We still perform these ceremonies of violence. They just take different forms. And while it may not be for a religious purpose, these forces still remain in us and become even more terrifying because they're combined with the new technologies, with the new developments of modernization. In the following years, after this ballet premiered, Europe would destroy itself from the inside with horrible psychological and social results, which the remainder of the class will see unfold in the arts, the responses to this mechanization of war and violence. So I will see you guys next week for a much lighter and a much funnier moment of comic relief in Satie's Parade. And it's a funny work, and I'll give you a much shorter lecture as well. So till then, toodaloo.